Matthew Bell with Alzheimer'sProof.com, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about bilingualism, and in particular the supposed link between being bilingual and delaying the onset of Alzheimer's disease. This is a somewhat complex and unfolding issue. This is one of those occasions where researchers in some areas are hopeful, but there's no definitive connection. I'm going to look at some of the highlights from some current research, and we'll just kind of try and get a fix on where the issue is at and how confident a person should be that bilingualism is effective at delaying Alzheimer's disease, under what circumstances bilingualism would be effective, and what that means for somebody possibly trying to devise some kind of a strategy for avoiding Alzheimer's disease, as indeed I myself am. So let's get into it. All right, so the question is essentially, does bilingualism guard against Alzheimer's disease and other forms of cognitive impairment or dementia? Now, this is an issue because there are a number of recent news articles and things that have come to light where this is precisely the claim that's made. For example, here, Medical News Today, and you can see the headline said, "How Bilingualism May Protect Against Alzheimer's Disease." And in this particular article, the journalist is referring to research that was published in Neuropsychologia, the journal, and it says it supposedly reveals that bilingualism makes changes in brain structure that are linked with resilience against Alzheimer's disease and mild cognitive impairment, or MCI. Once again, Health Day. This one actually was a link that I got to through the Alzheimer's Association. News link: bilingual people may have an edge against Alzheimer's. Then under that, the subtitle: study found they did better on memory tests than patients who only spoke one language. And again, here it even made it into the mainstream news. This is CBS News: learning another language may help delay dementia, and that was published on November the 6th of 2013. First sentence of the article here: a key way to avoid dementia may be learning another language. Live Science, similarly, learning a second language protects against Alzheimer's disease, and you can see that was published in 2011. Now, first of all, let's ask the question and answer it: what is bilingualism? So the definition of bilingualism you can see here from Merriam-Webster, and the first definition, I'll just go right to that. Number one, the ability to speak two languages. So bilingualism, two languages. Google, if you just type in define bilingualism into a Google search, the little snippet is going to read this: fluency in the use of two languages. Now, I note that simply because being bilingual doesn't necessarily just refer to you having had a couple of semesters of college Spanish or college French, or even having more than that. Bilingualism, on at least one definition here, is going to be fluency in the use of those languages. And so there's going to be some distinction that's made between picking up the second language in the context of immersion in a culture and a country where they speak it and picking it up in a classroom. Now, the question basically is, and this is from the Mayo Clinic: does bilingualism delay Alzheimer's disease? And the answer that is given by this author on the Mayo Clinic's website is possibly. So he notes that studies on this question have had conflicting results. But essentially, this is going to refer to something, it's going to implicate something called cognitive reserve. For those people who think that bilingualism does delay Alzheimer's, they're going to appeal to something called cognitive reserve. Presumably, the author of the Mayo Clinic article was thinking about studies that have come to light that essentially are along the lines of this here. And I accessed this particular study, and you can see the name of it: Bilingualism as a Strategy to Delay the Onset of Alzheimer's Disease. This was published on October the 19th of 2017. And essentially, this was a study, and you can see I accessed it through National Center for Biotechnology Information, specifically the National Library of Medicine, which is a part of the National Institutes of Health. You can see that this article was published in Clinical Interventions in Aging, abbreviated in the little box below as ClinInterv Aging. In this study, you can see here it was a literature review, in the first underline there in red. This study was a literature review, meaning that it didn't actually have any new experimentation. It simply looked at other studies that were done. It looked at a total of 14 original studies, 6 were prospective studies, and 8 were retrospective studies, and it says both types of studies suggest different conclusions. It says that the prospective studies state that there is no association between bilingualism and the delay of onset of Alzheimer's disease, while the retrospective studies claim the opposite. So 6 of the studies said no, that bilingualism did not delay dementia, and 8 of them said yes, and depending on whether they were a prospective or a retrospective study made the difference. Pro in this context means before, and retro basically is looking behind you. So for example, retrospect is turning back, looking back. How cognitive reserve affects Alzheimer's. You can see this now. The issue, as I said, for those people who think that it does have some delaying effect, generally they're going to appeal to the concept of cognitive reserve. So how cognitive reserve affects Alzheimer's disease. And you can see here that in this Very Well Health article, cognitive reserve is defined as the ability to build up additional capabilities to compensate for the possibility of declining memory or thinking. And then it says here, think of it as overtraining to run a race. So the idea with cognitive reserve is that you have a layer of redundancy, if you want to say it that way. The brain has the ability to perform, let's say, a task in multiple ways, so that if way number 1 is undercut, you lose the ability to perform a task using way number 1. You can perform the same task using way number 2. In the overtraining example, the illustration that came to my mind was the idea of a batter in baseball swinging a couple of bats in practice swings to get up to the plate to be able to hit the ball. So in other words, to improve bat swing speed or some other kind of reason, baseball players will sometimes, you'll see them swinging 2 or 3 bats in practice right before they step into the batter's box, and they also may use one of these little bat weights or bat donuts. But the idea here is that they're gonna, if they can swing the heavier bat, then they can swing the lighter bat. If they can swing 2 bats, they can swing 1 bat. If they can swing the bat plus the donut, then they can swing just the bat. And so this idea of overtraining doesn't mean training to a point where you are putting yourself at a deficit. It rather just means that you do more than what is necessary, so that you have kind of room to fall back. The same article from Very Well Health also observed that there are really 2 different kinds of reserve. There's passive reserve and active reserve. So passive reserve, also referred to as brain reserve, in this article is defined essentially in terms of the physical size of the brain or the number of neurons. They note that you really can't do anything about the size of your brain, at least not according to mainstream medical science. You really can't affect the size of your brain positively. You can't make it bigger. Maybe it will shrink. Certainly Alzheimer's can kill portions of the brain and cause it to shrink. Other things might cause it to shrink, but not a whole lot is going to cause it to grow in the relevant sense. But your passive reserve, or your brain reserve, then is got to do with the number of neurons that you have and the physical size of your brain. Now the active component here, active reserve or cognitive reserve, is an ability. It's the ability of the brain to cope with damage by using compensatory structures or compensatory processes. So it says using compensation or different brain processes to retain the ability to function well. Even if you lose the ability to perform a task using pathway A, pathway B may still be available to you. Here, kind of another way of thinking about this is, you can see being bilingual, and this is on the ALZ forum, being bilingual buffers against Alzheimer's by improving connectivity. In this sense, you can see that one of the ways of understanding cognitive reserve is in virtue of thinking about it in terms of different pathways in the brain. So if one pathway is destroyed, literally, if you have multiple neural pathways, you have improved connectivity, maybe reaching to certain memories, reaching to certain words, enabling you to perform certain tasks or function a particular way. If you've got multiple pathways, if one pathway is destroyed, the other can be used. And so this improvement in connectivity is one hypothesis for why bilingualism may help to, quote, buffer against Alzheimer's disease. Here, the Alzheimer's Society, and this is the Alzheimer's Society is based in the United Kingdom. The Alzheimer's Society's article here says bilingual brains are more resilient to dementia, and yet they note in the very first part of this that it's lifelong bilingual. So note that lifelong bilinguals have increased connectivity in certain areas of the brain. Now that's an important distinction. Earlier I said there was a distinction between learning it through immersion, let's say in a country, and learning it in a classroom. But here again, another important distinction here, learning as an infant, being a bilingual speaker from early in life. Once again, in a book, Bilingual by Choice, and this is by Virginia Ragueneau. I'm not a Francophile. Looks like a French name here. So Bilingual by Choice, subtitle is Raising Kids in 2 or More Languages. And in the middle of the back matter of this book, and this is available here on Google's book repository, you can see that the author says, or the person who authored the back matter in any case says, research shows that learning a second language from birth can even result in protection against Alzheimer's later in life. So once again, we're talking about bilingualism from birth in the first place. And then that raises the question, at what age does our ability to learn a new language like a native speaker disappear? And it says in the subtitle here, this is from a Scientific American article, but it was available through the website Pocket. And you can see here, despite the conventional wisdom, research shows picking up the subtleties of grammar in a second language does not fade until well into the teens. Further into the same article, based on people's grammar scores and information, etc., researchers concluded that the ability to learn a new language, at least grammatically, is strongest until the age of 18, after which there is a precipitous decline. To become completely fluent, however, learning should start before the age of 10. So we have a diminishing ability to pick up language apparently in the relevant ways. And so this, I don't know. I mean, one of the things maybe to take away from this is that it would be good to try to introduce new languages into your household. One concern, obviously, when we think about Alzheimer's is a person who has it already. Then we have the person who, like in my case, my dad died from it. My grandma had it when she died on both sides of my family. So I'm trying to devise strategies that might minimize my risk. Maybe I can introduce some of these things, but you can see here that this bilingualism as a protection really has to start young. And so maybe, I don't know, maybe I introduce it with my children in the hopes that maybe I can't use it effectively or as effectively as I would have been able to had I been raised in a bilingual house. But maybe I can help prevent Alzheimer's from ravaging my children or their children by introducing a strategy that would introduce a second language into the home at a very early age. The same article, however, wants to point out, Scientific American still, that it doesn't mean to say you can't learn a new language if you're over the age of 18 or over the age of 20. And then it says there are numerous examples of people who pick up a language later in life. Our ability to learn new vocabulary remains constant, but probably you won't be able to master the grammar like a native speaker, and you probably won't have the same sound. You're going to sound like a foreigner who's picked up the language rather than like a native speaker. You can see alzheimersproof.com on an article that I did. You can see here that one of the strategies for boosting your brain activity is indeed learning something new, like a new language, like a new instrument. And so you can see that obviously people do advise, because this is just a summary statement, essentially this article, of strategies that other people advise as to how you can minimize your risk of Alzheimer's or how you can delay some of the effects perhaps of Alzheimer's. And one of the things is try to exercise the brain, try to give it a workout. You can see your puzzles, brain teasers, do something creative, but also learn something new. So the upshot is there is still a non-negligible body of people who are recommending that you start a new language, even if you're over the age of 18, and I certainly am. So there's kind of a mixed review of this. There's kind of a mixed perspective, but Alzheimer's.net seems to be amongst those who are fairly positive about the hopefulness here, and you can see they've published several articles. I just have two examples here. First one says, A Secret Weapon in Dementia Prevention, the Bilingual Advantage, and the second one, Bilingualism May Delay Alzheimer's by More Than 4 Years, and those were published several years ago, but you can see a somewhat enthusiastic perspective. And so even the Mayo Clinic, which has to be credited for its very dispassionate and sort of even-keeled appraisal of this in its very short article on the question, says ultimately just go for it. If you're interested in doing it, if you think it might be effective, just go for it. However, more research is needed before it's known whether learning a second language later in life has the same protective effect as it might have if you learned it as a very young person. So a lifetime of being bilingual is essentially what is going to protect people according to the research, rather than learning for it later in life. But that doesn't mean that it wouldn't protect you. It just means more research is needed. The jury is still out in terms of the effectiveness, but as I write here, many authorities advise you to bet on the side of bilingualism. So as I've said in other places, I think of a lot of this in virtue of a bet that you make in terms of whether or not an intervention might help you or hurt you. And when you think about some of the overarching recommendations, they are basically to keep the brain active, to keep it well nutrified. So diet's going to play a huge role. Possibly supplements might assist you in that regard, or herbs, as I cover in other videos. But another aspect of that is going to be keeping your brain fit, and you think about that in terms of physical fitness. You exercise the body to keep the body fit, exercise the brain. The brain is part of the body. exercising the brain becomes an important strategy then in a lot of people's minds in terms of interventions. And I would say with respect to that then, why not? If you have the ability, if you have the inclination to try and pick up a second language, I would say, as the Mayo Clinic says, go for it. Now, having said that, I don't necessarily know that it should be left to simply an interest that you have. You might even think there might be more functionality for you, more effectiveness if you don't really have an inclination to do it. And the reason there would be, it would be outside of your comfort zone. It would be something maybe that you're really genuinely causing your brain to have to learn to do, something that it may not be familiar with already. And that might give you a further boost. But once again, as I've said in other places, I will simply say now, I am not a medical professional, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a nurse, I am not a medical researcher. All of this is simply my airing, my representation to you guys of research that I've done in the hopes that something that I said may be of use to you and that you may be able to follow up on some of the research leads that I'm providing to you. If you found something of interest in the video, please like it, please subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell to be alerted to new content as it becomes available. I thank you so much for being with me today, and I look forward to seeing you again in another video.